Hello, everyone. I'm Debbie O'Kane, and on behalf of the North Fork Environmental Council and the North Fork Audubon Society, I am very happy to present to you Roxanne Zimmer, who will be leading this workshop this evening. Even though it's a virtual workshop, I'm sure we're going to be learning lots and lots and lots of different things. And one thing I learned even before we're getting started is that there are a number of different ways to compost, different techniques. I'm intrigued by the lasagna method and the worm method, so really looking forward to this presentation, Roxanne. Roxanne is the community horticulture specialist for Cornell Cooperative Extension in Riverhead, and she does lots and lots and lots of outreach. Spoke with 550 people this past weekend virtually, spoke with over 13,000 people last year back in 2020. So Cornell Cooperative Extension is doing an incredible job getting people involved in gardening and different types of agriculture, and just we're so grateful to have you here, to have you, Roxanne, and to have the extension in our community. So it's just a wonderful resource. What I'd like to do is just mention that this evening is actually a part of a series. NFEC and Audubon for quite a number of years has offered seminars on organic landscaping, on organic lawn care, native plants, really focusing on what we can do as homeowners and, really bringing it down to the individual level. So we are going to be offering a second part in the series. It's scheduled for April 21st, and that will be really focusing on sustainable lawn and landscaping practices. And then in May, we will have Robin Simon offer a workshop on creating a rain garden and really focusing on native plants. So we will be sharing that information with you all shortly. We thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I'd just like to mention that we're going to be saving any questions for the end. Dawn will be moderating the Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. So I think we're ready for the magic of compost, Roxanne. Okay. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Debbie. And with this presentation, I will provide my PowerPoint and discussion for you. And then after my presentation is done, we'll go back out and take all of your questions. So let me begin. And Debbie, yes, you can see that slide?
Yes.
Okay, absolutely. Great. So, so you know who I am from Community Horticulture for Cornell Cooperative Extension in Suffolk. It's my pleasure to train master gardeners. I love to come to community groups like yours. I'm also a resource for school and community gardens. Anyone with a question, please just drop me a note at rz378@cornell.edu. You're very lucky in Suffolk County to have available to you the free services of our Hort Diagnostic Lab. If you've got a gardening question tomorrow morning, maybe there's something weird going on with your lawn or a tree or a shrub, by all means, dial or press 631-727-4126, and that's between 9 and noon with your gardening question. It's also true that you can send a photograph of what may be ailing in your garden to Alice at aw242@cornell.edu or to Sandra at sib7@cornell.edu. For any of you thinking of checking the pH of your soil, this is a good time to do so. And we accept samples we will be actually changing this to our Riverhead office on 423 Griffin Avenue, which we hope to go into in about a week. We've been out of there for 2.5 years. And that brings us to what we're talking about tonight, the magic of compost. I love this photograph because you get a sense of, oh my goodness, there's an onion and some greens on one side. How on earth does it become that other beautiful brown something on the other side? Right? It's just gorgeous. So tonight we're going to talk about compost, which is the end product of some kind of decomposition of all stripe of organic matter. And then we're going to actually talk about composting, which is the process in which you encourage or engage the right mix of organic materials, greens and browns, and they decompose. I guess I'd like to say that we think we do a lot of this work. It's really the microorganisms, some macro, but mostly microorganisms. And that process could take as little as 2 or 3 months, or as much as about a half a year, the composting process. So tonight we're going to focus on why we should compost, how in fact it works, what's doing the work, and then indeed, what are the various composting methods that each of you can do? So why on earth should we compost? Regrettably, this photograph reminds us of why we should be composting. You see all of the awful plastic and all of the other stuff in this toxic soup. Our landfills are loaded with materials, and indeed, there's little room for all of our, if you will, trash or garbage. And the problem is, within this pile of stuff are wonderful organic materials that should have been diverted from this landfill. It should have been diverted to your backyards or your front yards in your composting process. The U.S. Environmental Conservation folks remind us, the EPA reminds us that there's a lot of our stuff in our homes that can and should be composted. Just take a peek at these numbers. About 7% that goes to the landfill is paper. And now we all have a lot of cardboard that's added to that mass. Food scraps that could have been composted, as well as yard clippings and other wood. So we need to put this back into the land. We need to compost to improve the health of our soil. It's very simple. Compost improves the soil quality by helping it retain moisture if you've got sandy soil, and then wick away moisture, if you will, if you have too much clay. Compost also, very importantly, feeds the organisms in your soil. It reduces the need for fertilizer, and it's good for not only our soil, but it's excellent for our groundwater and our bays. Not to mention the fact that compost is terrific for flowers and the vegetables we want to grow. Whenever I show this slide on healthy soil, people are a little surprised. You know, they're always surprised that there's so much air, not necessarily the water. Note that the organic matter in healthy soil is only about 5%. And then that's broken up into other parts. So I guess the question I want to ask is, does organic matter matter? Absolutely. It increases the quality of the soil. It's helpful with the water, whether you have sandy or clay soil. It also reduces the erosion of your soil. And compost stores food for slow release, not quick release, but the bacteria, the beneficial fungi, protozoa, and earthworms need a substance like compost. And this is your organic prize. When I meet folks in person, I say, you know, this is your hummus. And then everybody laughs. This is your humus, right? It's a long U. This is what gives soil that fantastic smell. And what is this humus stuff? It is a very stable substance. It took a while to accumulate, but similarly, it takes a while to be depleted from your soil. It is that which helps plants take up nutrients from your soil. It is that which is increasing both the aeration and the water holding capacity, and is that which is crucial for the soil's biological activity. So what do you do with this compost? Well, you should be thinking about the following every single year. It's not a bad idea to top dress, and that simply means sprinkle a quarter to a half an inch or an inch or so on the top of your soil and very gently rake it in. And if you're trying to do something more serious, you might take about 2 inches of compost. So you're getting your tomato or vegetable garden ready. By all means, put some compost right on the top of that soil. You don't even have to work it in. It will come in naturally. And when you dig in the plants, it will filter down. Many people have existing beds. You may have perennials or shrubs there. So just top dress and put it around the base of those beautiful plants. And what if you've got an established lawn? Well, this is what you should be doing, probably twice a year, in the spring, but more importantly, in the fall. You get a wheelbarrow full of compost and you drop these little piles all across your lawn. I just can't wait to see more and more of my neighbors doing this. And then what you do is take out your rake and then gently rake it back into the lawn. Yeah, for about a week or so, your lawn might look a little funny, but the decomposers are going to pull up that compost. The message goes out, there's compost up on top, and it's all going to come down and help make your soil a much better habitat for the growing of your grass without adding any other kind of chemicals or other substances to your lawn. So where can you get this good stuff? Sure, you can go to your big box stores and buy it in those big 20 or so pound bags. My concern with that stuff is that it really doesn't have a lot of vitality. It's been in that bag much too long. You're better off, if you can, get to your local nursery and get a couple cubic yards of it, and it's usually loose, and they deliver it to your driveway. Or you are maybe lucky and you can go to your municipality, and indeed they will, for usually a nominal sum of money, make compost available to you. Now, about municipalities, they should provide either on their website or to you if you ask for it, the actual analysis of that compost for the year. This is from the town of Southold, and you see that an independent lab does the analysis of the compost. So that's something that you can certainly ask for if you don't see it on a website. But the best compost source of all is your own. It's a win-win for a couple of reasons. Not only do you know exactly what's in your compost, but you are diverting this waste from the overloaded landfills. And when this goes into the landfill with all of the other things that are in the landfill, it does not become organic matter again in some other wonderful form like compost. So this is what you need to start collecting in your own home to make your own compost. Okay, simply, organic matter is what you need to start to gather. For newbies, I always recommend one of the easiest ways to start a compost pile, and that is to have leaves and leaves only. You see in the upper left, the leaves there in the fall, and that's what they look like down the bottom, probably by the end of the winter. And then by the summer, on the bottom of that leaf pile, you'll have that wonderful garden gold known as compost. And you just put your hand down in the bottom and you know that you've got it. So this is a good way to begin if you've not tried anything else. Then there's other organic matter around. You might drink coffee or you might drink tea. My goodness, not only the coffee, but if you used a filter of some kind, that goes right in your compost pile. Eggshells, I never wash mine. I just crunch them up and put them in the compost pile. If you cook, which many of you do every night, all of your vegetable scraps can go in. Your yard clippings, again, nothing with disease, but that stuff in your yard. And if you happen to live by the sea, you may put in seaweed. All of this can easily go in your compost pile. I never wash the salt off of the seaweed. I just put everything in the compost pile. So when I put it in, I'm generally aware of this guideline. I want brown materials, which are sometimes referred to as the carbon or dry materials in your compost pile, with some amount of greens or the nitrogen sources, or sometimes referred to as the wet materials. So to put it very simply, leaves would be browns or carbons, grass would be green, wet, and nitrogen. And you want to put the two of them together because that speeds up the process of decomposition. Now, you can have, as I just said, a wholly brown, a wholly carbon, a wholly dry materials compost pile. That's fine. It's just going to take longer to decompose because you're not adding any nitrogen. However, under no circumstances should you have an entirely green or nitrogen pile. And I'll tell you how and why. You know you don't want it because it's going to smell like the dickens very shortly. So you want a compost pile that's roughly 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And that's considered the appropriate volume for your compost pile to reach a temperature of about 160 that starts to cook it. I mean, I love to go to my compost pile in the middle of winter because I just stick my hand in and it's so much warmer than anything else around, because indeed it's not cooking as much as it will in the summer, but it indeed is warm in there. You don't need to water it. The snow and the rain will keep it sufficiently moist. And then look at the illustration at the bottom. You want roughly a 3-to-1, 3 browns for every green, 3 carbons for every nitrogen. That's the easiest way to think about how to balance what's in your compost pile. And here are just some of the materials that are considered green or nitrogen or brown and carbon. All of us have a lot more cardboard these days. If you're putting it in the compost pile, as best as we can, try to cut it up or shred it. And then I mentioned some of these other wonderful materials that would be considered nitrogen. Now, what doesn't belong in that compost pile? You see that invasive plants. You don't want to put diseased plants. And why don't you want to do that? You don't want to spread any other kind of disease that might be in the compost pile. So when I look at a plant, and if I see in any way it's got something on it I don't like, I will actually put that in the trash, out to the garbage. I won't put it back in the compost pile. And with potatoes and tomatoes, we're always worried about what's called late blight, which those of you who remember your Irish history know that that was the cause of famines in Ireland in the 1800s. So just to avoid that, in general, I usually put tomato and potato structures into my garbage as well. No manure from pet, no dairy, grease, meats, bones, or fish. Yes, you can put wood ash in, but no glossy or waxed paper. Most of our inks in paper products, non-glossy, are made of soy, so those are fine, but not those others. So maybe something weird is going on in your compost pile, right? It might be winter, not much is happening. Maybe you need to get in there with your pitchfork and give it a little more aeration because the leaves have become too compacted or matted down. But these are the problems I was talking about if you don't have the right brown to green ratio. And I want you to focus on the one that smells like ammonia. So I had a landscaper guy in my neighborhood who saw that I had these big compost piles in the back. And he said, you know, would you ever like grass clippings that I get from your neighbor who's got this organic lawn and so on and so forth? I said, sure. You know, I love organic matter. By all means, bring it on. So one day I was in the kitchen and he's piling barrel after barrel of these grass clippings on my compost pile, and he goes away. And about half an hour later, I go, oh my God, it stinks. What's that smell? And of course, I realized, oh my goodness, he put all of that green on top of my compost. So lucky for me, I had the season before collected the leaves that were in bags that my neighbors nicely put out for the municipality to pick up. I picked them up before the municipality got there, and they were in the backyard for just an emergency like this. So I emptied 3 big bags of leaves on top of those grass clippings, and within about a half an hour, the smell had dissipated. Yeah, I had to get in there with my pitchfork and kind of move around, but the smell was gone. So if you notice something peculiar, it's the ratio of your green and brown, and you probably need more carbon to reduce the effect of the nitrogen in the green materials. So who did all that work for me? And who's doing all that work for you in your compost pile? When I go to talk to school kids, I show them this slide and I tell them it's very simply, it's the FBI at work in your compost pile. And that's an easy way to remember the beneficial fungi, the beneficial bacteria, as well as the beneficial invertebrates. Now, most of the F and the B are microorganisms, and there are hundreds of thousands of them in a teaspoonful of soil. You can't see them. Yes, we can see insects and earthworms. What I'm going to do tonight is just tell you about one F, one B, and one I that's doing tremendous work in your compost pile. And the F and the B, we really don't see, so we tend to forget that they're there. And, you know, we don't have an electron microscope, but let me tell you what it is that they're doing. So this is one of those wonderful, wonderful goodies in your compost pile. It's a beneficial fungi. And here's a big fancy word, mycorrhizae. If you've ever walked in the woods, you've knocked over a piece of wood, you'll often see something like this on the underside. Well, what you're looking at is a beneficial fungus, something that has a mycorrhizal association with whatever it is decomposing. It enables plants to develop this secondary root system that in turn helps them take up all kinds of wonderful nutrients in your soil. On the left, we have a plant with no mycorrhizae, no beneficial fungus in that mix it's growing in, versus on the right, that's loaded with beneficial fungi. Wow, look at the difference of that root system. Here, a field You see the patch with mycorrhizae in the soil and without. So this is a wonderful fungus among us. And then what about some of these other wonderful microorganisms? I like to think of them as a secret garden. Here they are magnified many, many times so you get a sense of who they are in the soil. Let me just talk about one. I mean, these are two. I think we have streptomycin and something else here that's a beneficial bacteria. But I'm going to talk about Rhizobial bacteria. So this Rhizobial bacteria that needs compost to help it grow has a really important role, particularly with plants that are considered legumes. In your lawn, this is your clover. You might have the plant Baptisia, or you want to grow in your vegetable garden peas or beans. All of these are wonderful legumes. And what's so neat is that the bacteria, the Rhizobial bacteria in the soil, magically helps that plant grab nitrogen literally out of the air and brings it down into the soil and forms that nodule that you see in these various pictures. And what's so terrific is that that's nitrogen from the air that the Rhizobial bacteria captured, that indeed then when this plant is no longer, there's free nitrogen, if you will, around the plant as well as feeding this plant as well. So Rhizobial bacteria is fantastic. And then the eye. These are some of the invertebrates in your soil. I'm only going to talk about one, which is very familiar to all of us, and that's the earthworm. You see in those two illustrations on the left, without earthworms, look at how narrow that band of topsoil is. With earthworms, it's almost double, and notice that the soil is looser such that those leaves of grass can actually go back in and help regenerate the soil, right? It's, again, another source of its own fertilizer. So earthworms are fabulous because of what it is that they do in our soil. I was going to say, they wiggle around and they actually open it up for us. And when worms poop, the vermicastings, they add this tremendous substance to our soil. So the composting approaches we're going to talk about tonight are primarily aerobic, with air. But I want to say something also about the anaerobic, without air, composting approaches. Now that we know who's doing the work in the soil. So you could, in theory, put all of your organic matter in a plastic bag or some kind of container, hope it's shut tight, and you will find that that will, in fact, decompose over a period of time. Right? You could put all of your stuff in there and it will decompose. Some people do this essentially by digging a trench of some sort. And indeed, they pour all the scraps in there. And it does decompose. The trick is, depending on the season, you can't always dig. These anaerobic processes tend to be slower than the aerobic. They sometimes can release a stinky smell. And then the weed seeds are usually not as fully destroyed because it's cooler in this anaerobic process than it is in the hotter aerobic composting. Now, let me just say here a word about Bokashi, because some people were talking about it earlier. This is not a compost process, but it has a similar effect. This is what's called anaerobic fermentation. So this is something you could do in your home, and this is a way to break down materials through a fermentation process and little to no air, or anaerobic. So you need some kind of a bin, And take a look at that starter bran. Well, they call it starter bran and eco Bokashi. I know that it's a bacteria. It's a bacterium that will, like the Rhizobial bacteria in the soil, this particular bacteria, you sprinkle it on your stuff that you put in here, and then you as quickly as you can cover it, because this is an anaerobic process of fermentation. So you want to go in there only once a day, quickly dump your stuff, and then close it. Yes, you can put meat and dairy scraps in here as well. I don't think, however, that when this stuff is done, it can go directly onto your soil. I think this is perfect then to put in your compost pile to continue its decomposition, because it tends to be a little acidic and it needs more time, if you will, to cure. But Bokashi fermentation is a good indoor way to provide this anaerobic fermentation process that is yet another way to reduce your waste. But it's not compost. So what are then those more common aerobic or with air composting approaches? Siting really does not matter. You don't need to have sun. It can be on the ground or it can be above the ground. Contact or no contact with the soil, and access to whatever rainwater does in fact fall. So you would not want to put this under the eaves of a structure. Method one, my favorite. Do nothing. Just make a pile, forget about it, and let the stuff rot. You see the wonderful heat, or if you will, steam coming out of this compost pile as it's decomposing what's going on in there. This is larger than the 3 by 3 by 3 that I was suggesting, and that's good because the more you've got going on here, the more likely it is to happen more quickly. A variation on that theme is this 3-bay process. You've got your incoming stuff here on the left. Then as that starts to decompose, you move that to the center. And then at the very end, you would put the most decomposed stuff that you're going to be putting in the soil soon in the last bay. And, you can make one of these, yourself with non-treated wood. You can find the pallets around. You can use screening. You can be creative and indeed create a 3-bay system if you like. Method 2. This is sometimes referred to as lasagna composting. It's often referred to in the permaculture approaches, as well as sheet or mulch composting. And you get the idea from the words and colors on the side that essentially what you're trying to do is a layer of cardboard or a newspaper first that you're going to wet. And then it's brown, green, and then depending on how quickly you want to plant in it, you may be putting compost or topsoil or garden soil right on the top. So these are guidelines, not rules. My sheet composting that I've done has never looked this neat or that good. But note again, you've got cardboard or paper on the bottom. Maybe straw, leaves, manure, and you alternate, and then you're actually planting in the top of this. Here's another, side view of brown paper bags, and then you've got your mixture of elements. Now, we live on Long Island. I assume everybody here in this may even live on the East End tonight. Why is this approach of lasagna or sheet composting particularly valuable for all of us? We live on Long Island. And how much time does it take for an inch of soil to naturally form on its own? And the answer is, all right, between 200 and 1,000 years for an inch of soil to form with none of our intervention. You see in that illustration, there's just like that little bit of nice soil there up on top. Well, it takes between 200 and 1,000 years for that to have formed. Well, what do we know about our geology here on Long Island, right? This is a map of the US from the USGS. I happen to know from looking at the key that those red soils in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin and Minnesota are the oldest. That means they're also the deepest. Take your eye down to the Gulf of Texas, go around the Panhandle, go down to Florida, and then come up the East Coast. You see Long Island sticking out there, where that different color, with that very light color, as you see here, just like Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Block Island. What that means is we, because of our relatively new formation, are young compared to these other places in the US. So if we are young, we have very shallow topsoil because there just hasn't been enough geologic time for soil to form, right? So we have very, very shallow, for the most part. Some of you may have a wonderful deep bed, most of us don't. So compost and organic matter placed on top of our soil, making raised beds, makes oh so much more sense than digging up that little shallow inch, 2 or 3 that we have and then mixing it up. So think about, rather than digging your soil up and tilling it in any way, better to put compost on top and incorporate organic matter there rather than mixing it below. Because on Long Island, we have such a shallow layer of topsoil. Another reason why sheet composting or lasagna composting is great. You don't have to dig. It's a lot easier on your back. So you get out that cardboard, you think about where you want to put a new bed or where you want to reduce your lawn, because that's what you all should be doing. You know, we can keep some part of our lawn, but we should be putting native plants or vegetable gardens in other places. So you lay out this cardboard, you might want to put a couple of bricks on it, water it down, and then that will surely and slowly kill the grass. And indeed, you don't have to dig. And that's when you start adding your materials to, in fact, have a raised bed where there was once grass. No digging required. I know a number of years ago, I said, oh, this can't possibly work. And I wanted to put in an herb bed in my yard. So I, in the fall, did all these things, put the cardboard out, made the layers, and I was so pleasantly surprised in the spring, I actually could plant my herbs in this sheet lasagna compost bed that I made without ever picking up a shovel. It's terrific. It needs obviously a little time to set in. Okay, a third method. Some people, if they have a small backyard, are concerned about critters and rodents, will take a look at any one of a number of devices that are on the market, whether they are compost bins or tumblers that you see on the right. Now, these are useful in small yards, and yes, they contain what's in it. You have to buy them, between $75 and $100 or so. My objection to them, or I should say my concerns, and what you should be aware of. For the most part, they do not hold as much of that cubic yard, that 3 by 3 by 3 that they should. And it never gets as hot perhaps as it might if you just had a pile. So too, there's a limit on capacity, because once you fill it up, You know, you may have like many, many, many more things in your yard you want to put in there, and it's stuffed or full. So I would recommend that for those of you who are starting out, that you might put your vegetable scraps and some leaves or paper in here, and put your leaves and other matter that you're not worried about in another spot in your yard, and then just let that rot. And again, you can kind of make your own variation of these. You see the wire bin on the bottom. Those leaf paper bags, what I used from my neighbors, that will actually decompose. You know, the bag may rip too, but you're going to find compost in the bottom of that. And then check out those garbage pails. That was a great do-it-yourself project there. You see how they made all of those holes so that there would be plenty of aerobic decomposition going on. Now, here's something else that functions a little bit differently than those compost bins, and it's called the green cone. This one happens to be made by Rubbermaid, but there are a couple of these around, and these act in a little different way. Let me show you. So these are called cones or solar digesters. These too can take materials that you would not want in your compost pile, like meat and dairy. But the difference is you need to dig or place these underground, as you see in this illustration, and you've got to put this in sunlight. And this is what essentially you're doing. You're submerging that bottom cone, if you will, underground, and then you're going to put the cone on top, into which you've got it in the sun, and we'll put your materials. Friendly suggestion. If it were me, I would put a chicken wire fence or material around that bottom black base, because you don't want critters going in there if you've got meat and other scraps. So too, that material for the most part is going down into the soil. It's not readily accessible as your compost pile material would be. But the beauty of this, like so many of the things I'm showing you, it's a great way for you to reduce your matter, the organic matter that would otherwise be going to the landfill. So this is a solar digester. All right, and then method 4. Worm or vermicomposting. What I like about vermicomposting is you can do this in your home. I do it in mine. All right, you can purchase a kit like you see in the bottom right, or make your own as you see in the top right. I can't tell you how important worm castings are for things that grow in your garden. In these illustrations, you see something that's just in the soil with no amendments. Then in the center, that's a plant treated with a synthetic fertilizer. Synthetic is another word for chemical. And then look at the plant and how happy it is with worm castings. Again, no worm castings on the right. Wow, look at that corn on the left. So we're familiar with red earthworms on the top left, but I'm going to talk to you about a different worm tonight, and that's the red wiggler. It's a little smaller than the earthworm that we're very familiar with. Perhaps it's not as deep a color. But the red wigglers are considered by most the superior composting worm. And if in fact you're going to do worm composting, you want red wigglers doing the job for you. Red wigglers are not here because our winters are too cold. So this is a worm that you're going to find south of us, because they can't do our winters. They're fine in our summers, our spring, and our fall. So I've had very good luck with Uncle Jim's as a worm source. There are others that provide red wigglers. And when you get a bag like this, you say, how can there possibly be 1,000 worms in here? What I love about what Uncle Jim sends you is you've got babies and teenagers in that bag to help promote the next 2, 3, and 4 generations of your worms, which are going to reproduce in your worm composting. Yes, it's prolific as a breeder, and indeed it will give you a lot of wonderful, it will eat that organic matter. It's imagined that it is an excellent fertilizer. You see how much of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and magnesium it has, potash, and so on. So the worm poo, or if you will, the worm castings, are tremendous for your soil. Here is a commercial worm bin. Here is a do-it-yourself worm bin. And as I say, I do this in my basement. It's absolutely fine in your home. Someone said to me, aren't you worried about the worms getting out? And I said, no, they're very happy in there. If I feed them and the conditions are right, they don't want to leave that space. And you see all of the holes that you need to make, because obviously they're living, and this is part of an aerobic process as they decompose the organic matter. You then use these in your soil. You can make a foliar spray of them, sprinkle them on your compost, or if you've got a plant that's hurting in some way, they are absolutely terrific. Worms will eat your browns and greens just as all of the critters will in your compost pile. Again, the same ratio of browns to greens, and what I do is use shredded paper. That's much easier in the house as my primary source of browns. And you can top dress your soil with them. You can make a worm tea. And then here's what I want to show you. If you were to buy a wonderful source of an amendment for your plants in your soil, you might consider cow manure, dehydrated cow manure, and it'll cost you plus or minus $6 to buy 25 pounds of it. Look at the price of worm castings, same amount, same volume. So that just tells you, oh my God, what a wonderful resource this is. These worms that all year in my home ate my organic matter, and indeed I can put out in my soil, and what a win-win this is for the environment. What, if any, then, are the threats that undermine the benefits of compost? Have I got the wrong lecture? Why are these guys in my talk? We have on the left, on the right, we have Lance Armstrong and Alice Rodriguez on the other side. Some of you who follow sports know that these were two very high-performing athletes, yet they sought and used other substances that included steroidal kinds of materials to enhance or improve their performance, which it in fact did. So what is the equivalent of that in our soil? It's the synthetic, it's the chemical, it's the non-organic fertilizers. Whatever their name is, it's the 5-10-5, the 10-10-20, or so on. These materials, yes, are going to give you impressive short-term results, but they cause a chemical dependency. Your plants are going to be looking for them, your grass, because you're going to need a constant supply for results. And the real problem is they're throwing off the natural balance in your soil food web. Remember those FBI that I said were working out of sight? They cannot deal with the strength of synthetic, chemical, non-organic fertilizers. And in the long term, that's undermining their ability to perform well on their own. So the best thing you can add to your garden is compost. If any of you want to take a look at some sources of where to learn more about doing your own compost, The Brooklyn Botanic Garden series is terrific. Stu Campbell's Let It Rot is a classic. And the Rodale Company has been involved in composting for many, many years. You know, at old bookstores, you can find his composting methods from the 50s or the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, or a newer version. So Rodale has been at this and very much committed to composting for many, many years. It's also true that we here at Cornell Cooperative Extension provide this home composting little brochure. I can send this to Debbie after we're done, and she can send that out to each of you. And this home composting guide essentially repeats or identifies some of the primary directions and guidelines provided in tonight's presentation. If anyone wants to, you can take a photo of the address up there, or when I send it to Debbie, she can get that to you. This is the home compost guide from Cornell. And that brings to a conclusion this portion of the composting presentation. My hope is that you have a better understanding that this is in fact magic, that nature does this all on its own, and it's only a win-win for us reducing our waste, as well as a win-win for us enhancing the quality of what we have going on in our soil. So then I welcome, encourage you to ask your questions if you haven't already, as I segue back to join you in the group. So I don't know if there are any questions, or you can take them. I see two. I just don't know if those are questions from this session that we can address.
So I'll read them off. Thanks, Roxanne. That was amazing. Such a good presentation. The first question is about options for indoor composting if you don't have any room outside.
So you can do the Bokashi, which is fermentation, but also it is a way to reduce your organic matter, your food scraps and other things. And the worm I do the worm composting in my house. So the worm composting is probably the easiest thing for you to do inside your home. You might have a garage that has, you know, a warm enough space for it in the winter if you don't want it in your home, or a basement or some other area, but you absolutely can do worm composting in your home. For those of you in apartments, you know, that would be a perfect solution.
Okay, the next question is about red wigglers. It said red wigglers will not survive if you put them directly into the soil. I guess the question is, will they survive if you just put
them? So yes, they're going to survive in our soil until it gets cold. So you can put the red wigglers out there, right? And they'll have a bowl, they'll eat everything in your compost pile. But comes the temperatures that we had this year in January and February, they're unlikely to make it through the winter. Even if they found a warm spot in the compost pile, they might just not make it. So that's why the red wigglers typically stay in the home. Now, I will say that I was on a food security group, part of a group with of Canadians, and we went to Cuba a number of years ago and visited a lot of farms. And they had only red wigglers in their large outdoor worm bins. But they can do that in Cuba because they never get the kinds of temperatures that we do in the wintertime. So they can leave them outdoors. And my guess is in other parts of the United States, it would not be a problem to leave them outside. But if we have winters as we do, you run the risk of losing them.
Okay, the next question is, should we add fertilizer to the compost heat to hasten the decomposition? Also, should we add lime to the compost pile if we have mostly oak trees?
Oh, okay. So you don't need to add, and I would not recommend that you add fertilizer to your compost pile. No reason to do that. No reason to do that. There are products, and I see people selling, says these are called compost starters. You know, get your compost pile going. And what are they? they're the fungi and they're the bacteria that I was just talking about. So again, you don't need to buy any of that stuff. If you're putting the right amount of green and brown in your compost pile, you know, those are just other products people are getting you to buy. Now, a question about if you have too much of one kind of material, might you add lime? Those of us who live on Long Island may have a lot of oak trees and may have a lot of pine or pine needles. Those tend to be acidic. So it may well be that you want to get your pH tested. Cornell does it, I think, for $5 to see what your pH is so that you know whether or not you should be adding lime. But I would not, as a matter of practice, be adding lime to the compost pile. You need to know what you've got before you do that.
The next question is, can reeds and other shore grasses go into the compost heap?
Yes. However, if you've got Phragmites that were the invasive Phragmites that we're all trying to rid ourselves of, that would be something that I would not put in my compost pile, if that's helpful. So by all means, those other materials, if you've got ornamental grasses, oh my goodness, they're just wonderful in your compost pile.
Okay, the next question, actually, there's a question about showing the lasagna slide again. I don't know if you can go back to that, or maybe
I'll take a couple more questions and then I can just go back and screen share again.
Maybe
and
we'll
what was the question? What was the question about? Oh, but let me say that don't worry about getting it right. You know, I've never been that religious in my layering of green and brown, and sometimes I forget which is on top of one another. Just remember that you're putting newspaper, paper bags, or cardboard down first. You're wetting those thoroughly with your hose. Then you're probably putting another layer of brown, and then green brown. Maybe you do 2 layers. Maybe you do 5 layers. Maybe you do 8 layers. Doesn't really matter. What you need to think about is how soon do you want to plant in it? And if you're starting it today and you want to plant something there next month, you might need to put a layer on top of garden soil because you won't have enough that's already decomposed. Whereas if you started this last fall, you might be able to, in a month from now, plant right in your your lasagna because your lasagna has decomposed. So maybe that answers the question, but I'll bring the slide up again if it doesn't.
Okay, there is another question. When do you know when your compost is ready to use? I have a pile of horse manure in my yard from last summer and a warm composter in my basement going since August.
2 different questions there. Let's talk about the manure. Horse manure, cow manure, chicken manure. Terrific stuff that should be incorporated into your soil and your garden. But under no circumstances should it go in there, if you will, raw or new. That stuff needs to be aged, otherwise it's going to burn whatever it is that you're planting. So we recommend at least 3 to 4 months of aging. So you want to put that horse manure in some way so that the air can get at it, it can start to decompose. Some people will incorporate the horse manure, the cow manure, the chicken manure right in the compost pile, which is fine, so long as you're not reaching into that compost pile next week to spread that all over the top of your soil. So it needs to be aged. If you want to keep it segregated, to make sure it's aged, and then you can mix it up with your compost. And then there was a second question, a second part of that question.
The second part was that they have a warm composter in their basement going since August. So I guess the question is, when do they know it's ready?
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, so you know it's ready when it looks like compost, when you can see less and less of the tea bag or the onion peel that went in there. It starts to look like a very dark chocolate brown. You can feel it in your hands. It doesn't feel like the eggshell anymore. So I don't want to say you know it when you see it, but it looks like it's finished. All right. So you don't want stuff that still has the green and the brown in it. You want it when it's decomposed. Usually that is at the bottommost portion of your compost pile outside. And you can see that it's very different from something that's higher up in the compost pile. So if you've got worms in the house, you need to separate gently, to separate the worms from the compost, right? From what they've made or their worm castings, and then put that out to your soil.
Okay, great. There's a question about paper. You mentioned the types of paper to not compost, and I want to confirm that good paper includes newspapers, circulars, mail, envelopes and letters, and regular white paper with home printing.
Correct. And so what you need to do is on some of the letters now, the envelopes, you need to pull out that little window, you know, the clear window that's, you know, that looks like a, so take out that wax, that other kind of paper, but you can put in the white paper, the newspaper, because again, all of these are soy inks, or for the most part, they are soy inks. It's the glossy paper, the magazines that you want to dispose of in a different way. You don't want to put those in your compost pile. And again, if you can shred it or just rip it or cut it up, the more you shred it, the more you're enabling the decomposition to happen quickly, because there's more, if you will, surface area for the critters to get at. So absolutely, white paper, lined paper, envelopes, you know, circulars that are not waxed and, you know, glossy. Perfect for your compost pile. And then all of those are excellent for your worms.
So there's a question. I bought the can at the store and it has the black filter on top that causes mold to grow in the can. Is that normal?
I'm not sure. What do you mean by a can?
I'm thinking the can, I'm thinking it's a, the tumbler, or maybe it's some kind of composting container.
Okay, let me say that some people, when they're in their homes, don't want to walk out every day and go to the compost pile. And so they've got some kind of something in their kitchen typically, or by the side door, in which they accumulate their stuff. If you leave your stuff in there for too many days without putting it out, you know, because that's kind of a closed thing, you know, that's where you can get mold, and you want to, as soon as you can, just put that out in the compost pile. I wonder if that's the can that they are referring to. That's my guess.
I guess just make sure you bring it out sooner.
Sooner than rather than later.
How many of the 16 LPUs on Long Island, local planning units which manage waste, have compost centers? Are there any?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, the rest of the question is, are there any maps made available of where they are by Cornell or any other source?
You know, I don't know. I do know that Cornell campus up in Ithaca had a map of waste management sites of a particular stripe, and I don't know if it's size. So that may be helpful. I don't believe Cornell Extension, we have such a map or guide, but that might be something that you check out with Waste Management Cornell, or perhaps the New York DEC. That might be a question for them, but that would be neat to know. Every municipality is doing something different with its waste. So there is no universal answer, I think, to that, but it's a great question.
Last question. I also have chickens using the deep pile method with wood chips in their coop. I clean it out several times a year. Can this be used in my garden as well? Absolutely.
Fantastic. Now, wood chips, depending on what your source is, you want those to decompose some, because you don't want to put those into your, let's say, tomato bed or cucumber bed, because they would be sucking away too many nutrients from, if they're decomposing where you're trying to grow your plants. So let those decompose. Keep them in your compost pile for as long as you can.
Okay, I think that's all the questions we had. Thank you so much, Roxanne. Did you want to say goodbye, Debbie?
I was just wondering, Roxanne, did you find the diagram for the lasagna method?
Yeah, I'll go back in and share my screen.
Okay.
I'm not sure which one they want, but let's see.
And I'd also just like to mention that there are 2 local farms here on the North Fork, Treber Farms and Deep Roots Farms, that will accept your kitchen recycled waste. So if you would like to contribute to their composting efforts, I would give either one of them or both of them a call and just see what their criteria are, what their guidelines are for accepting food waste. Excuse me.
Let's see if I can get this easily. I don't know which slide they're trying to get access to here. Here's the lasagna composting. I don't know if you can see it.
I would say it's that one. I would say it's the lasagna sheet method slide.
This one.
Great. Yeah. Could you enlarge that one?
Well, it's not happening easily here. Let me go back. Let me stop share. Okay. Okay. When I get there, we'll know it, right? We'll see it. This is a review of all the slides.
Uh-huh.
Did I pass it?
Not yet.
Here we go. So here's one slide. Here's another. So see the topsoil on the top? If you had done this in the fall, you would not need topsoil there or manure, because all of those other things would have decomposed already. You know, you might put some in, but you wouldn't need it. If, however, you want to plant in this area that you just started this year, you want to plant in a month from now, you're going to need topsoil on the top for those items to grow. Right? To give you a sense of what this looks like. All right.
Fantastic, Roxanne. You did such an incredible job. Thank you very, very much for joining us this evening. Happy composting. And if you have questions, Roxanne did share her email address, and I will be happy to share the information on the composting flyer from Cornell Cooperative Extension as well. So
great, Debbie. This is good.
Thank you very, very much. All
My
right.
pleasure.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.